Welcome back to Danielle O'Terry's Italy. To celebrate the 4th of July, today I'm taking you to a piece of Italy in the United States. It's Little Italy in the Bronx, which is also called Arthur Avenue. Now, just a quick reminder that all episodes of the podcast are free, but if you value this work, I invite you to become a paid subscriber. It's just $8 a month or $80 a year. Subscribers get access to a monthly Q&A with me on Zoom. There's a monthly destination deep dive. In June, I did Cilento. In July, I will be focusing on Florence. If you're interested, just go to danielleoterry.com. Now, let's go back to the Bronx. It's a place that is very special to me because I am also the owner of Arthur Avenue Food Tours. In 1918, my great-grandparents opened a bacala store at 2374 Arthur Avenue. Bacala is cod that's preserved in salt. You have to soak it for a really long time in order for all the salt to come out. It kind of stinks up your house, but it's really delicious when you bake it with potatoes. Their 3 sons became butchers, and one of them was my grandfather, and they took over the shop and then opened other shops as well. And my family has been tied to the Italian food business ever since. Now, in 2010, I was working as an art historian at the Met Cloisters, when a friend saw that Melissa Clark, the food writer from the New York Times, wrote on Twitter that she was looking for somebody who was very familiar with Arthur Avenue to take around a group of food buyers who were visiting from London. They worked for Marks & Spencer department store. And they were in New York seeking inspiration for new food products to develop, and they wanted a guide to the historic shops in this neighborhood. Because it's a place that I know really well and love, I walked them around the neighborhood, told them stories, told them the best things to buy in each shop, introduced them to some of the shopkeepers, and they were delighted by everything that they saw. They couldn't believe that there were so many old world artisanal shops still alive and well in New York City. Now, the thing about Little Italy in the Bronx is there are very, very few Italians that still live there, but there's this incredible concentration of shops, historical, artisanal food traditions, things that you don't even find in Italy anymore, truly like the fly trapped in amber of many culinary traditions. You'll find 3 bakeries that make just fresh bread, nothing else, every single day. And there are pastry shops and salumerias, which are called pork stores in the Italian-American vernacular. Then there's the Arthur Avenue Retail Market, which started off as a pushcart market in the 1930s and is still open and thriving. It's an incredible survival. This enclave of family-run food businesses here in New York City, which, as I like to say, is a rapacious hellbeast when it comes to real estate and prices. So the fact that these places are able to survive is because they are still family-owned, and many of the shops are owned. The physical shops are owned by the family that is still working there, and those mortgages have been paid off for many decades. So this is an incredibly unique place with some very interesting economic conditions that allow them to do things that you just simply couldn't afford to do elsewhere, no matter how much talent or notoriety you have. When I walked around that group from London, at the time I was trying to evoke Anthony Bourdain. He had just skyrocketed in popularity, and so my idea was to create an experience in the Bronx that kind of felt like an episode of No Reservations. At that time, food tours were just starting. You found them here and there, but it wasn't really a thing. At the end of this afternoon with the food buyers, they handed me like a really healthy wad of cash, and I was working at a museum where you do not make very much money, and I said, wow, I wonder if I could turn this into a business. And then from there, the idea for Arthur Avenue Food Tours took off. Since then, it has been featured in CNN Travel, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, New York One, NPR, USA Today's Top 10. In 2018, the artist Jenny Kroik joined a tour, and she did a painting of a GDO pastry shop that became the cover of The New Yorker. It was so exciting when it came out. And she also did additional illustrations that were featured in the online version of the magazine. And there's one of me cradling a loaf of olive bread that some friends have told me makes me look like the Virgin Mary. So honestly, it feels like a miracle that there continues to be this concentration of truly small, artisanal, family-run food shops in New York City. I'm sure that my great-grandparents would never believe this. And my mission is still to keep Arthur Avenue thriving for another generation. And what I try to do and what the guides who work with me do is introduce people to these shops, get them hooked on the fantastic products that they have for sale. And if they have a good time, hopefully they return. They tell their friends because there's no place else in the United States like Little Italy in the Bronx. So this episode is dedicated to a mystery, one that I hope after listening you might be able to help me solve. I just published a small guidebook. It's called A Shopper's Guide to Arthur Avenue, Little Italy in the Bronx, and it's available on Amazon.com. I'll leave a link in the show notes. Let's go back in time to the early 1900s. I first learned the official story of Arthur Avenue on Wikipedia, and then I confirmed it in several Bronx history books. I am a historian, and mostly these books have been published by the Bronx Historical Society. And this is the official foundational story. The Belmont section of the Bronx was once owned by the Lorillard family, the same Lorillards who had a huge fortune in tobacco. And their holdings included the land where the Bronx Zoo and the New York Botanical Garden now sit. In fact, the New York Botanical Garden still has a building known as the Lorillard Snuff Mill. It's where all the fancy events and the weddings take place. Catherine Lorillard Wolfe supposedly inherited this land, and she donated a big chunk of it to become what is now the New York Botanical Garden. But then she also sold other parcels to New York City, but she had a request, and that was that the main thoroughfare be named after her favorite president, Chester Alan Arthur, 21st President of the United States, a man that she admired greatly, and she also paid for a statue of him to be placed in Madison Square Park in Manhattan. And that's how people say Arthur Avenue got its name. And I believed the story too. There was no reason to doubt it. But then I started noticing another name pop up over and over again. It's Pietro Cinelli. And I first saw it on a building at 2393 Arthur Avenue. It's above a discount convenience store. And the building itself looks like a small Italian palazzo. Now, if you open the front door, you'll see these beautiful hand-painted tiles, and inscribed on the glass transom is Cinelli's name. It's right there in huge letters, Pietro Cinelli. Then I noticed across the street, above the awning of Full Moon Pizzeria, there's a coat of arms, and Pietro Cinelli is inscribed on that as well. So clearly this man was very important, and yet he is almost completely absent from the narrative. Now, the only place where I would see his name come up was in stories about the old movie house, which was called the Cinelli Dumps. And it didn't start off with that name. It was called the Cinelli Savoy. And there are some great illustrations of that old movie theater. And it had one of the oldest moving picture cameras in New York City. It fell into decline in the 1970s. They were showing pornos. And at that time, it earned the nickname the Cinelli Dumps. So I started researching. Cinelli was a wealthy immigrant from Le Marche, and he started to buy land in the Belmont section of the Bronx, which was a small village. And I looked at maps, and I saw that there was a school, a laundry, a bookbinder. So the entire urban grid that we see today was there. This was the first clue that Catherine Lorillard Wolfe did not donate this land. It was already an existing village. And then there were lots of adjacent farms that were being sold off en masse. As the Bronx was now no longer part of Westchester County, it had become part of New York City. So Cinelli was developing apartment houses, and he built his own house right in the center of the neighborhood like an Italian palazzo. There was even a branch of the Banco di Napoli there. So Cinelli, as a real estate developer, started marketing his apartments to his fellow Italians, and he was doing so mostly in East Harlem. East Harlem, before it was Spanish Harlem, was Italian Harlem, and it was the largest Little Italy in the United States. Now, those immigrants were living in really tough conditions. They were in poorly constructed tenements that had already been inhabited by generations of Irish and German immigrants. The area was famous for crime, fires, and then there was also the constant threat of the Black Hand, which was a criminal syndicate that was the predecessor of the Italian mafia that really developed during and after World War II. That's a fascinating story. I should do another podcast about that. So Cinelli decided to secure a charter from the Archdiocese of New York to build a new church in the Belmont neighborhood. Now, This is really, really interesting. Italians in East Harlem had built a church. It was called Our Lady of Mount Carmel. It's on 115th Street and Pleasant Avenue. It's still there today, and it's gorgeous. And Italian laborers built this with volunteer labor. And then the Irish and German clergy, who did not approve of how Southern Italians practiced their Catholicism, segregated them. So the people that built the church were not allowed to worship in the basilica, in the main church area. They were forced to worship in the basement. This went on for nearly 30 years. There's an excellent book called Our Lady of 115th Street if you're interested in learning more about this. It's written by Robert Orsi. It's very friendly and very readable, so it's kind of the best of both worlds. Lots of interesting footnotes as well as a very readable tone. So in 1904, Cinelli forms a committee. He petitions the archdiocese for an Italian-speaking priest and a church in this new area that was developing. And there was also a mission established. And the mission was in this storefront where today you'll see a sign for Esposito Social Club. There was a statue of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. It was wrapped in a sash to collect donations, and this was something that Italian mutual aid societies did at the time. People would pin money or jewelry to the sash, and it was kind of like a sacred savings account that they were using to fund the new church. Now, if you look at the church today, which is called Our Lady of Mount Carmel as well, the sequel, the first cornerstone was laid in 1907. And you'll see the lower portion, which is made out of this gray stone, was there. And they actually put a roof on it at one point and called it the basement church. So that cornerstone was laid in 1907, and they had raised enough money to complete the upper basilica by 1917. If you look at the stained glass windows, they bear the names of many Italian families who funded the construction. Now, because Arthur Avenue is a neighborhood of new construction, there was a lot more economic diversity. And in fact, this is one of the myths about the early Italian immigrants, that everybody was poor, that everybody came here with nothing but the clothes on their back, and that's simply not true. Cinelli was quite wealthy, but nonetheless, the opportunities in Italy at that time were just not great. And there were many Italians who did not come from difficult economic circumstances, but they also came to the United States to make their fortune. Now, this is where the story takes a really dark turn, and this is where we'll meet the mystery that I'm trying to solve. I began doing research in early 2020, right before COVID broke out. I like the cold months for cozy research projects. And I was spending time at the Bronx Historical Society, and immediately, as soon as I started the work, I knew that the Lorillard story was false because I pulled out maps, and I found maps going back to the 1870s, and Arthur Avenue is there. It's called Arthur Street. This is before Chester Alan Arthur was even born. So this whole story about Catherine Lorillard Wolfe seems to be fiction that was invented in the 1980s. I searched a lot of records. I looked at the New York Times archive. I had lengthy conversations with the librarian there. I paid for a full year of newspapers.com and scoured it. Of course, I used the New York Public Library. And from all the records, deeds, articles that I found about Catherine Lorillard Wolfe, she never owned any land in the Bronx. And she was a descendant of the Lorillard family, but not a direct descendant of that branch of it. And so I have no idea how this story that has nothing to do with Little Italy was imposed on it. Chester Alan Arthur, also nothing to do with the Bronx, nothing to do with Italian Americans. The only interesting thing I could find about him was that he, as a young lawyer, helped to desegregate the subways. But other than that, he's not even a very notable U.S. president. But I did find something about Cinelli. It was published on July 6th, 1906 in the Brooklyn Citizen, and it was syndicated in newspapers around the country. It reads, Captain Brennan of the Bronx Police Force and a score of detectives are searching today for 4-year-old Lina Cinelli, daughter of Pietro Cinelli, a wealthy real estate dealer and head of many Italian organizations, who declares the child has been kidnapped. The girl left her home, 2396 Arthur Avenue, yesterday to go with a playmate to her house. This was the last seen of her. Cinelli owns more than $100,000 worth of property in the Arthur Avenue neighborhood. He's been an active agent with the police in suppressing a lawless gang that has terrorized the district. And as a result, has earned many bitter enemies among his countrymen. Mr. Cinelli said today he believed the Black Hand was at the bottom of the affair. He said that on several occasions he had received threatening letters demanding money with threats of kidnapping to his children. There was no follow-up to the story that I could find in newspapers, and I spent a lot of time looking. But Lena does appear again. She's living with her family in the 1910 census, but in 1920, she's no longer there. I do know that the extended Cinelli family remained on Arthur Avenue until the 1990s, and I found Pietro Cinelli's obituary also in the New York Times, dated June 9th, 1936. It says, Pietro Cinelli of 2393 Arthur Avenue, the Bronx, died yesterday at the New York Postgraduate Hospital of cirrhosis of the liver. He was 68 years old. Mr. Cinelli was born in Italy and came to this country 38 years ago, acquiring real estate holdings and ownership of 2 motion picture theaters. The first of the theaters was started about 20 years ago as a Nickelodeon on 187th Street and Arthur Avenue. Both became known as the Cinelli Savoy Theaters. They were leased about 6 years ago when Cinelli gave up active management. 5 sons, Albert and Dr. John Cinelli, physicians, Nicholas Cinelli, an attorney, and Joseph Cinelli and Salvatore Cinelli and a daughter, Mrs. Adelaide Marguscelli, survive. I did track down an existing family member on Facebook, and I reached out to her, and she said that she regretted that her father had passed away a few years prior because he was the historian of the family. He was also a physician, and he had done a lot of research and was very, very proud of this story, but she really didn't remember any of the details. And she believed that there was a box somewhere that had his papers and his research, but it wasn't something that she could locate. And after inquiring with some other family members, she didn't think it was possible to find any more information. So I have been contemplating this for years. What was it that made this important Italian-American and his name be scrubbed from the history books? And this other story with people that have nothing to do with the neighborhood, who aren't even Italian, be given credit for its foundational myth. I have a couple of ideas based on context, but of course I'm not sure. So let me tell you what I'm thinking about. One theory is that Cinelli came from Le Marche, a different region of Italy than the majority of Italian Americans. And Italians were and are still extremely regional. But certainly in the early 1900s, dialects, customs, and mutual distrust kept people really far apart. It's still that way in Italy today. You'll hear people from the north speak terribly about people from the south. And you'll hear people in one town talk about the town that's 5 miles away like it is the worst place on earth. And there was a lot of tension in the social classes. The Italian-American myth of immigration today is really that of somebody coming from nothing, working really, really hard, saving money, buying property, and making the family fortune. A lot of Italian Americans don't have that story, but they've created it. And my family is guilty of that. Now, that is pretty much the story on my mother's side. But on my father's side, my great-grandfather, Albino Oteri, who opened that bacala shop, he came to the United States on a ship in first class. And I had always heard the same stories, the same thing, working hard, saving money, buying property, and making the family fortune. It's true. But as I began to dig deeper, I found that the Oteris were connected to the noble classes. In the 1700s, that's as far back as I've been able to go so far. I'm going to go deeper. They came from Modica, Sicily, which was then associated with a medical school and the Spanish viceroyalty. And then one of the family members moved to Sarno, which is near Pompeii. And up until my great-great-grandfather, all of the men in the family continued to be doctors. And then I learned that my great-great-grandfather was working as a scout for the King of Italy. This is in the late 1890s. And he was killed when his horse navigated straight into a pit of quicksand. Yes, I know, if you grew up in the 80s like I did and watched Looney Tunes, dying of quicksand seems like a ridiculous joke, but it's true, and the land around Mount Vesuvius is very alluvial. And because of that, my great-grandfather, Albino, wasn't able to pursue medical school, though there were others in his family, his immediate first cousins, who did. He came to the United States instead to make money. And he had money when he came to get started. And one of the things that my grandfather always said set them apart from the rest of the people on Arthur Avenue, and then also made it uncomfortable and created tension, was the fact that Albino insisted that they speak what was called High Italian. So I would say that's textbook standard Italian, as opposed to Calabrese, Sicilian, Neapolitan, all the many regional languages that people spoke. So here we are at this place in time where it might be impossible to retrieve so many of the stories of the early founding of Arthur Avenue because all of the people directly connected to them have passed on. But I know that there are people that have stories, maybe just pieces and fragments of them. And in the rise to prosperity in the United States, Italian Americans really leaned more toward union jobs and entrepreneurship, not so much academia. And as a result, Italian American history has a lot of really big gaps. So I would love to fill some of that in. For example, just to explain better what I mean, the Jewish community of the Bronx did an excellent job of writing down their own history. And if you visit the Bronx Historical Society today, their story is very, very well documented, while the Italian story really isn't. So this is what I want to figure out, and maybe you can help me. Why do you think Cinelli was repressed from the record? I think that this line in the newspaper article is critical. Bitter enemies among his countrymen. He was somehow seen, I think, as a turncoat or a traitor or a snitch, and maybe somebody who was not adopting the identity of the working class Italian, somebody who was seen as a snob, perhaps. I'm not exactly sure, but I know the answer is somewhere in there. And if you have stories in your family that maybe don't fit the mythology of immigration, ask. Find out more because they all matter. It's not like immigration isn't a hot topic these days, so learning more about history is never a waste of time. There are so many lessons that we can continue to learn from the past, and if you have stories of your own, ones that go beyond the warm nostalgia of Nona's meatballs, I know that they're amazing. Meatballs are definitely important, but stories that fill in this more complicated part of our history, I would love to hear them. So let's keep telling these stories. They matter. And now here's my invitation to you. Please go shop on Arthur Avenue. If you're in the New York tri-state area, one of the reasons it's so well preserved is that it's actually difficult to get to on public transportation. But there are big municipal parking lots, and lots of people who started off in the Bronx moved to Westchester and Connecticut, and they drive in and they do a ton of shopping. They put a cooler in the back seat and they buy the best quality meat and fish and cheese and, of course, beautiful bread and have lunch. It's a fantastic experience. And if you're visiting New York, you can take the train there, you can take an Uber there, but you're going to find incredibly high quality ingredients run by families. There are still families behind the counter of every single shop and restaurant. And so the goal of Arthur Avenue Food Tours is to continue to sustain this piece of living history. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed learning about this little piece of Italy in the United States. And I'll see you next week.